Everything in order?
Yep.
You know, to be honest with you folks, I'm not the craziest fan of open world games. I don't hate them by any means, it's just that games with an open world have simply not provided me with the most memorable experiences. And as such, I would be satisfied if Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 retains the same style of approach to adventuring and exploration as Part 1. Now, I also recognise that I'm kind of in the minority here. A few hours ago I created a poll asking for your opinions, and more than half responded by saying that you would prefer FF7R2 to be playable within an open world. However, this video is not really about any of our views of an open world game. Rather, the important question is, how do the FF7R developers feel about taking Part 2 into this direction, and are we likely to see more of an open world environment going forward? As always, if you'd like to be notified of future Final Fantasy VII Remake news and updates, then please do consider subscribing to my channel, Fuzzfinger Gaming. And a shout out to Omni/Strife for a wonderful show of support by becoming a level 3 channel member. Thank you. Ever since we learned that the first game in the remake series would be ending at the point where the party departs Midgar, fans have been speculating that the world would be opening up for Part 2. And this certainly makes sense. It was in the original Final Fantasy VII, after all, that this was the point where the world map became available for the first time, and the player could now traverse from town to town. Interestingly, discussions have been taking place within that poll's comment section between some of you who would argue that the OG Final Fantasy VII became open world at that point, and others of you who would disagree, instead arguing that the world map was not really anything more than a means of simply moving the player from A to B. Now, at this moment, we have very little official information from Square themselves about how the world map is going to be handled in the as of yet unreleased parts of the remake, whether it will be reimagined as some fully explorable open world environment or done away with completely. We simply do not yet know the approach that will be taken. However, I do want to share a couple of quotes from developers and interviews that may contain a few clues that help us to get a better picture of where things might be going. Unsurprisingly, these quotes were originally given in Japanese but have been translated for us by Twitter user Audrey. And the first comes from game director Tetsuya Nomura, who states in the Ultimania, "If we divide the story into more detailed, smaller sections, then developing it will be faster." Now, I do not believe it is the case, as some have asserted, that Nomura is arguing for Part 2 to be shorter in length than Part 1, but rather that the story is going to be more focused over the course of the game than it was in the original FF7. Of course, with the original game, we would begin by spending several hours within Midgar, and then once we'd made it to the world map, we'd simply be moving quite quickly between town to town. And while for the original game, it was certainly a fantastic means of telling the story, it would seem quite at odds now to go that route in lieu of what we got with the Part 1 of the remake. And I think that's what Nomura is saying here, that Part 2 won't be the party spending a couple of hours in Calm, then off to the Chocobo Ranch for an hour, then through the Mithril Mines for some Fort Condor action before heading over to Junon, but rather that the plot is going to be advanced with a specific focus on the story that they want to get into Part 2, and the locations we visit will be selected to serve that purpose. And if this does turn out to be the case, then it sounds like Part 2 will not be the open world environment that many are perhaps expecting, instead with a much more narrow focus on a specific aspect of story. And also, in a more recent interview, co-director Naoki Hamaguchi had this to say: "We didn't think it was necessary to create an open world for FF7R as long as there was a strong story-driven game." Now, technically, I believe only Part 1 was the context of his statement, but it does at least demonstrate some further insight. For the developers, they are not setting out to make an open world game, they are instead focusing on making a story-driven game. And of course, it's worth remembering that even in a more linear experience, as with FF7R Part 1, there is still ample opportunity for exploration and optional content to discover. Now, while I do strongly suspect we will be getting plenty of that good stuff in Part 2, I do not at this point believe we are going to be getting a true open world environment. Of course, we'll need to keep up with any further development updates before we can know more for certain, but in the meantime, please do share your own thoughts in the comments, and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel for future Final Fantasy VII Remake videos, and I look forward to catching up with you in the next episode.